I'm going to join you down here. Is that cool? Why are you sitting so far away? I don't spit, do I?
The chairs are locked together.
Hey, if you got your Bibles, Matthew chapter 14 is where we're going this morning. Matthew chapter 14. We're in week 2 of boat stories. And I got a little bit of a boat story. It's not like crazy adventurous, but somebody invited me to go sailing on Thursday on Lake Winnebago. And it was a little bit choppy that day, but it was good sailing weather. I got to captain the boat. I got to steer the boat. It was awesome. I took Lila with me. She did good. Let me just say she held everything down, but she struggled a little bit. That was her first time sailing. And so the story I want to talk about today is some guys who were in a boat on a lake, but they were not in just some chop. They were in a storm. And we find that here in Matthew chapter 14. So let's go there this morning. Matthew chapter 14, here's what Scripture says. It says, immediately after this, now understand, this is taking place right after the miracle of where Jesus fed the 5,000 people. Okay, so he fed 5,000 people. They gathered the scrapfuls of food left over. And then after that, Jesus is going to dismiss the crowd and he sends his disciples ahead. So Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." Now, they had this belief that you could see ghosts and things back then, and if you did, that meant that you were in big trouble. Like basically what they were declaring here is we're going to die. That's what they were saying. So, not just a little chop. This was severe weather here. But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I'm here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified, and he began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Isn't that an amazing story? It's about storms. Now, some of you know this, but Lisa grew up in Pennsylvania. I grew up in Ohio. And really, our weather there is a lot like here, except it is much colder here, by far. Okay? But we didn't really have tornadoes. We didn't really have earthquakes. You had the occasional thunderstorm and wind that would come through. You had the occasional snowstorm where if it was bad enough, you just hunkered down and waited it out and everything went on as normal, right? But when we moved to South Carolina, it was a whole nother ball game because they have hurricanes there. And we weren't used to hurricanes, and so just the thought of hurricanes, it was terrifying. So what we decided to do was we better be prepared. Just in case, let's have an emergency kit so we can be prepared if a hurricane comes. And so Lisa, she's the planner really. So she got this plastic bin. She put in, toiletries and water and all this food that would just save, granola bars, cans of soup, all that kind of stuff. Candles, matches, whatever you would need to kind of wait out a hurricane if you didn't have electricity or power for a couple days. And so we felt pretty good. We're like, okay, we're ready for the storm. And you know what? The longer we lived there, and the longer the storms didn't come, we started dipping into our emergency kit. You know how you do that, right? Well, I don't want to go to the store. We have this. So we started getting the supplies out, using them. And before we knew it, we had nothing left. Just an empty box. But yet we were so comfortable with where we were, we thought, you know what? What's the big deal? Why panic? Why worry? Hurricane hasn't come in 10 years. We're safe. And thank God, the whole 10 years we were there, we never encountered a hurricane. But some of you know, I think it was last year, 2017, the very area we were living, they were hit by Hurricane Matthew, I believe it is. Let me show you a couple pictures of what the area looked like where we lived. You could see trees going through houses, some of the boats just stacked on top of each other, just debris everywhere. And I would tell you that if we were still living there, we wouldn't have been ready. We wouldn't have been prepared. And so I want to talk to you today about how do you prepare for life's storms? Maybe another way of saying it is, how do you weather life's storms? Because what we know by now is that life's made up of storms, isn't it? And Jesus said this, not so that we would be afraid, but he said this so that we would be in the know. He said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. But he said, take heart because I've overcome the world. I'll help you weather the storms. And so life's made up of storms, and I'm not sure who said this, but there's a lot of wisdom in what they said. They said that when it comes to people, that we're either in a storm right now, and some of you would maybe acknowledge that. You would say, yes, Pastor, that's me. I walked in here today, and I'm in a storm. I'm up against something. I'm battling something. That's exactly me. Other people are coming out of a storm. Right? We're kind of on the victory side of things, saying, Lord, thank you for that. I didn't know I was going to make it through, but you were good, you were faithful, and now I can look back and just see how you've changed my life and how I made it through, right? You're heading out of a storm. And then some people, we're going into a storm. We don't know it yet. That's the trouble. We don't see it, we don't recognize it, but we're heading into a storm. So life's made up of storms. And how do you weather life's storms? Well, I think in the story we just read today, there's some things we can do to weather the storms. Here's the first thing. Just be aware that Jesus is there. And it sounds so simple, doesn't it? But yet, here's what we do. When we find ourselves in a storm, the first thing we usually do is panic. And we start thinking to ourselves, where's God? I mean, if God really cared, I wouldn't be in this situation that I am in right now. Where's God? I feel like he's left me. I feel like he's distant. I feel like I'm all alone. I feel like I'm walking in the dark and I don't know what to do. That describes us sometimes when we find ourselves in a storm, doesn't it? And I remember when I was 5 years old, I remember this as clear as day, my mom and I went to a Sunday night church service. And the adults met in the sanctuary. There was a basement area in the church done over where there were classrooms. So my classroom was downstairs. And then after church was over, we didn't have security like we do today. Aren't you thankful, parents? We got security and check-in. We know where your kids are and who your kids are with. See, I'm a little bit older than that. They just dismissed us. So I walked upstairs at 5 years old into the sanctuary, and I'm looking around, and I can't find Mom. I'm like, oh no. Like somebody said, snap, I'm in trouble. 5 years old. So I did what we do as humans, right? I started panicking. And I started thinking, well, our house is only about a half mile down the road. The trouble is we didn't have sidewalks. We were kind of in the country. So the quickest way to our house was a path through the woods. So I'm like, that's what I'm going to do. I left church, walked down this moonlit path at night to my house. Knocked on the door, lights are out, nobody's home. And I'm like, oh man, I'm really in trouble now. What am I going to do? And then I happen to remember we had some neighbors, couple houses down, who went to the same church we did. I'm like, let me go to their house, see if they're home. So I walked down that path again, moonlit path at night, get to their house. Woo, thank God they were home. Knocked on their door. They let me in. They gave me something to eat. I remember that. It was dessert. They contacted my mom. And as you can tell now, the story ends happily. But my mom, at the same time, she's freaking out. She's afraid. She's like, oh no, this is really serious. But then as everything got resolved, I remember she said this to me. She said, Mike, why'd you leave? She said, I was there all along. I was in the sanctuary all along. Even though you couldn't see me, I was there. And that's the message that God has for some of us today. That you find yourself in a storm and you wonder where God is. And God's message to you today is, I'm there. I see you. Understand, God sees you. You see, Jesus sent the disciples on ahead. And the Bible says he went up into the hills to pray. But what Bible scholars will tell you is that where Jesus was, he could see his disciples. He knew they were in a storm. He knew they were in a battle. He knew they were in a struggle. He was aware of their situation. He saw them. I'm so thankful for that old-time song, right? If God's eye is on the sparrow, then I know he watches me. He sees me. Are you thankful for that today? God sees us, and Scripture's full of this. Look at Job with me real quick. It just says this. God sees everything we do. And some people read that and they're like, oh no, I'm in big trouble. God's going to get me. But really what God's saying is, I see you. I'm not distant. I'm not far away. You're not in the dark walking this moonlit path at night. I'm there. I see you. I see you. Look what Psalm 33 says. It says the Lord watches over those who fear him. Psalm 34 says this. It says the eyes of the Lord watch over those who do right. So God sees you this morning. Regardless of how you feel, regardless of maybe what your circumstances are telling you, God sees you. But here's the other thing I love about God. Not only does he see us, but he cares enough about us to get into the storm with us. Aren't you thankful for that? That Jesus didn't just see his disciples struggle and just say, I'll pray for you. He left where he was and he walked out to the water to help his boys. He was in the storm. The problem is that sometimes we just don't recognize Jesus, right? We're in a struggle, we're in a storm, and we don't maybe sense his presence. We don't maybe see the provision that is right in front of us, right? We don't often recognize Jesus, but he's in the storm with us. Now about 7 years later, about 12 years old, I remember going on a camping trip with our church. We were part of Royal Rangers. It was like a Boy Scout ministry. And so we're at this camp, this weekend camp where all these churches were coming together and just camping out. And we're getting ready for our nightly meeting. So we're all gathered out there. And out of nowhere, the weather turns on a dime and a tornado basically almost lands right on top of us. The wind is whipping, there's hail, it's just pouring buckets of rain, and it happened so quick we couldn't run for shelter. So there happened to be this little ravine there, and all we could do was hunker down in this ravine. But I remember my dad was with me, and he had this poncho. And so he told me, just get up under the poncho. My dad kind of sat down on the ground, and then the craziest thing happened. I remember this. I fell asleep. And the reason I fell asleep is because I was at peace. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I was 12 years old, but I thought my dad was pretty strong. And I thought, you know what? If trouble comes, my dad's here. My dad's watching over me. And not only is he watching over me, he's with me in the storm. So why do I need to be afraid? Why do I need to worry? How about I just rest? And some of you, that's the word for you today. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. Rest. Because not only does God see you, but he's with you in the storm. I want you to see what Deuteronomy 31 says. It says, do not be afraid or discouraged. Why? Because the Lord will personally go ahead of you. Right? He's a way maker. He will be with you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you. I love what 1 Chronicles says. It says this, David's talking here, and he says this, be strong and courageous and do the work. Now this is talking about building the temple. They wanted to build the temple, and progress was a little bit slow. And David says this, don't be afraid or discouraged. For the Lord your God, my God, will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. He will see to it that all the work related to the temple of the Lord is finished correctly. How many of you know that he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. He's faithful to finish it. Our God doesn't change, right? He remains the same. He is an ever-present help in times of trouble. He promises He will never leave us or forsake us. So be aware that Jesus is there. That's how you weather the storm. And you know the other way you weather the storm? You have to fight your fears, though. Because how many of you know when you're in a storm, when you're in a struggle, when you're in something that seems bigger than you are, it's easy to be afraid. That's part of being human, is it not? And so it's interesting to me that as Jesus walks out to the guys on the water, the very first thing He says to them is what? Don't be afraid. Basically what He's saying to them is, hey guys, I know it looks bleak right now, but you have to fight your fears. Fight your fears. You have to overcome your fears. And that's the same thing that you and I have to do if we're going to weather the storms of life. We have to fight our fears. And so the question then becomes how? Right? How do I do that? I understand, but how do I fight my fears? And I like what Mike Foster said. I came across this, and I just want to share a couple of his thoughts with you because he says it a lot better than I could. But notice what he says. How do you overcome your fears? Here's what you do. You have to realize that fear will ruin your life if you let it run your life. Now let that sink in for a minute. Because that's where a lot of people are at today, unfortunately. They have allowed fear to run their life, and because of that, they're ruined. They're ruined emotionally. They have no peace. They have no joy. Their mind is going in all different kinds of directions, right? How many of you know fear, it'll rob you of just your strength. Fear will stress you out. Some people are sick in their body because they're just run by fear. And they're so stressed out. And they've got high blood pressure. And they've got ulcers in their stomach. And they've got everything else. Come on, church. Fear runs their life. Don't let fear run your life. Because if you do, it'll ruin your life. And then I like what Mike Foster says. He says this. He says, realize that fear only sees risks, not rewards. Fear only sees what is directly in front of it. How many of you know that? It doesn't see down the road. I like to say it this way, but fear's nearsighted. It's nearsighted. And I remember as my eyesight began to change when I got older, and I started struggling to read signs and things that were far away, I went to the eye doctor, and he's like, hey, Mike, you're nearsighted. And I was like, duh, now it makes sense. So Lisa will tell you this. When I first got my glasses, we're driving down the road, and it was dusk, and it was really hard for me to see at dusk, right? I just couldn't make things out and see things, and we're riding down the road at dusk, and it's like a whole new world. I'm like, hey, Lisa, did you see that restaurant right there? Did you see this sign? Did you see it said slow down? But I'm reading all these signs. And it just became so much clearer to me. And understand, fear is nearsighted. It doesn't see rewards. It doesn't see how if you push through some obstacle or you push through this storm, how it's going to make you better or how it's going to bless you or how it's going to strengthen you in some way. It just sees the don'ts. Don't do this. Don't do this. What if this happens? Okay? Are you receiving this, church? Here's the next thing you do. Understand this, and this is good. Recognize that fear can be a friend. Fear can be a friend. Because let's be real, God created us with the ability to be afraid. Did He not? And one of the reasons why is because He wants to keep us safe. Like Shark Week starts tonight. You should not swim with the great white sharks. That's not safe. That's not good, okay? So I'm making light of it, but we have fear for a reason, okay? So let it be a friend. But here's what you don't do. Give fear a voice, but don't give it a vote. Give it a voice. Let it kind of get your attention. And then you, with God's wisdom, say, you know what, is this viable? Or is this something that the enemy's going to use to hold me back and keep me from what God has for me? Because if that's the case, I say no. Let's go forward. Even though it may be uncharted waters, even though it may be scary, I'm moving forward, right? Give it a voice, don't give it a vote. And here's the last thing about fear. How do you overcome it? You have to realize or recognize that fear is not from God. Fear is not from God. Some people who are just overrun by fear understand this. That's not from God. Matter of fact, it's a little bit more than that. It's a spirit. Did you know that? Did you know that fear can be a spirit? And it can be a spirit that will run your life and suck you dry and delete you of everything that God has for you. And notice what 2 Timothy says. You can see this. Here's what Paul says to Timothy. Young Timothy, he's a pastor. He's afraid. He's facing some uncertainty as a pastor. And he says this to Timothy, Paul does, for God's not given us a spirit of fear. Timothy, don't let fear run your life, because if you do, it'll ruin your life. So God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, here's the good news, but of power and of love and of self-discipline. Power, love, and self-discipline. So how do you overcome fear? You trust God. You trust God. You know that He sees you. You know that He's with you. And you fight through your fear. And then the last thing you do to overcome storms or the weather life storms is you have to focus on Jesus. And again, guys, it sounds so simple. But let's talk about ourselves. Sometimes we don't do that, do we? When we're in a storm, when we're in a difficult situation, we look to our friends. We look to our bank account. We look to doctors. We look to Facebook. We look to our bookshelf to try to find answers. And do you know what happens when you do that? You sink. And you feel like life's caving in on you, and you feel overwhelmed. That's what happens when we take our eyes off Jesus, because that's what happened to Peter. Understand, Peter had the courage to get out of the boat. He had the courage to face his fears, right? And he's walking on the water, but the moment he began to look at his circumstances, he sank. And what's true with Peter is true with you and me. If we just look at our problems and if we just look at our circumstances, we will sink and we will be overwhelmed. Because here's what happens subtly. I don't think we realize this, but here's what happens subtly. When we take our eyes off Jesus and we begin to look at our circumstances, here's what happens. We become cynical. And sometimes that's where people are at. And did you know that sometimes people, even in the church, are more cynical than people outside the church? And it's interesting to me why. It's because we take our eyes off of Jesus. It sounds so simple, but we look at everything going on around us and we become cynical. And you know what else happens when we take our eyes off Jesus? We become desperate. You ever been there? It's like Peter, you're gasping for air, you're going to drown. I got to make it out of this thing. You become desperate, and then you become negative. And we don't mean for that to happen, but that's what the truth is. We take our eyes off Jesus, we become cynical, desperate, and negative. So here's what you do. Don't focus on how big your problem is. Because as a pastor, the last thing that I want to do this morning is say what you're facing is not serious or does not matter to you. I'm not up here to belittle you and make you feel like whatever you're going through is insignificant, doesn't matter. I'm not saying that today. But what I am saying is don't focus on how big your problem is. Focus on how big your God is. Amen. Focus on Jesus. Because I want to remind you today that He's bigger than your storm. He's bigger than your problem. He's bigger than your addiction. He's bigger than your doctor's report. He's bigger than your relationships in your marriage. God is bigger. And He's with you in the storm. But like Peter, here's the question. Will you reach out to Him? Because when Peter cried out for help, I love Jesus' heart. He didn't really berate him. What did he do? He reached down into the water and he pulled him up. And he led him back into the boat. And the storm was over, right? God's with you. But will you reach out to Him?